Just before midnight on November 17, 1978, a local manager walked into a brightly lit, empty restaurant and found the back door swinging wide open into the dark. Inside the Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road, the fryers were still warm, but the 4 young employees assigned to the closing shift had vanished. The safe lay open. 2 empty coin bags rested on the floor. This was the chilling beginning of the Burger Chef case, a mystery that would haunt the community for decades. To understand how the investigation failed so catastrophically, we must first examine the rigid operational system of the restaurant itself. The Burger Chef franchise operated on a strict, predictable nightly routine. Closing the store required a specific sequence of mechanical tasks that left a clear physical record of the timeline. The dining room was locked at 11 o'clock sharp. The registers were emptied, the day's earnings were counted into the safe, and the kitchen equipment was systematically scrubbed down. Employees were not permitted to leave until every task was completed, and the manager on duty locked the back door from the outside. This baseline routine meant that any deviation was an immediate indicator of exactly when a disruption occurred. On that Friday night, the procedural timeline abruptly shattered right in the middle of the closing sequence. Investigators later determined that the cash registers had been zeroed out at roughly 11:10. However, the final cleaning tasks were abandoned halfway through. The mop buckets were left out, filled with soapy water. The employees' jackets and purses remained untouched in the break area. This specific procedural anomaly indicated that the disruption happened with startling speed, catching the crew entirely off guard before they could finish their mandatory duties. The physical state of the cash safe provided another critical procedural detail. Exactly $581 were missing from the highest denomination stacks, yet a substantial amount of loose change was left behind in the open vault. The back door lock was undamaged, meaning it had been opened from the inside. Someone had either forced the assistant manager to unlock the safe under extreme duress, or a trusted individual had initiated the opening sequence. The evidence pointed to a sudden, highly coercive event that interrupted the strict routine. The immediate consequence of discovering this interrupted routine was a tragic misinterpretation by the initial responders. When the midnight manager called the authorities, the responding officers did not see a violent abduction scene. They saw a missing few $100s and 4 absent teenagers. The police concluded that the young employees had likely stolen the nightly deposit and gone on a joyride. This single assumption would become the fatal flaw of the entire case. Because the authorities categorized the event as a petty theft and a case of runaway youth, they failed to secure the building. The golden hour of forensic preservation evaporated in the early morning hours. There was no crime scene tape erected around the perimeter. The restaurant was left entirely vulnerable to contamination. The direct consequence of this casual dismissal was the irreversible loss of the most critical physical evidence the investigation would ever possess. While the police dismissed the empty restaurant, a creeping, visceral dread began to suffocate the families waiting at home. Parents watched the clock tick past midnight, then 1 in the morning, knowing their children were notoriously punctual. The agonizing silence of the telephone amplified their terror. These were responsible teenagers, honors students, and diligent workers who would never abandon their jobs or their families without a word. As dawn broke, that domestic anxiety transformed into sheer panic when the parents converged on the restaurant parking lot. They found their children's cars sitting cold and empty in the morning light. The sight of those abandoned vehicles was a devastating blow. It was the physical proof that their children had not gone on a joyride, but had been taken against their will. The families stood in the freezing parking lot, entirely helpless, realizing the police had wasted the most crucial hours of the disappearance. By Saturday afternoon, the sheer weight of the family's insistence forced a shift in the official narrative. The local runaway theory collapsed under the mounting evidence of the abandoned cars and left-behind winter coats. Law enforcement finally transitioned their focus from a minor embezzlement inquiry to a coordinated missing persons search. The scope of the operation expanded significantly, pulling in state resources and search helicopters to scour the surrounding county. This frantic transition culminated in a horrific discovery 2 days later, fundamentally altering the nature of the case. On Sunday afternoon, a hiker walking through a heavily wooded area in neighboring Johnson County noticed something unusual in the brush. The search for 4 missing teenagers came to an abrupt, devastating halt. The missing persons inquiry officially transitioned into an investigation of 4 brutal murders. The location where the bodies were discovered was a stark, isolated stretch of terrain known as Center Grove. It was a dense, hilly woodland located more than 20 miles away from the restaurant. The ground was covered in a thick layer of decaying autumn leaves and tangled underbrush, making it difficult to navigate even in the daylight. The sheer remoteness of the site indicated that the perpetrators possessed a chilling familiarity with the dark, unpaved backroads of the county. The crime scene itself was a chaotic expanse of violence spread across the uneven forest floor. The 4 victims were found in close proximity to one another, but the physical evidence of their final moments was scattered through the dirt and thorns. The natural environment had already begun to degrade the forensic clues, with the cold wind and damp soil compromising whatever delicate trace evidence the killers might have left behind. The woods held the tragic reality of the murders, but offered very few clear answers. To comprehend how the subsequent investigation unraveled, we must look at the law enforcement system in place at the time. The Speedway Police Department in 1978 was a small, localized municipal force. Their operational system was primarily designed for managing traffic violations, resolving domestic disputes, and handling minor property crimes. They were fundamentally unequipped to process a complex, multi-jurisdictional quadruple homicide. The Speedway law enforcement system lacked the specialized forensic divisions and rigid chain of custody protocols required for a major abduction case. When the initial call came in, there was no centralized command structure to immediately lock down the perimeter and dispatch specialized crime scene technicians. The organizational framework relied heavily on the discretion of the first responding patrol officers. This structural limitation created a disastrous bottleneck where critical decisions about evidence preservation were made by officers untrained in advanced homicide investigation. This systemic lack of protocol led to a staggering procedural failure on the very first morning. Because the initial officers believed the teenagers had simply stolen the money, they granted the restaurant management permission to open the store for regular business on Saturday. The morning crew arrived and immediately began their standard opening procedures. They were instructed to clean the entire facility to prepare for the breakfast rush. The specific procedural actions taken by the morning crew effectively sanitized the primary crime scene. Employees wiped down the stainless steel counters with industrial cleaners. They mopped the kitchen floors, sweeping away any potential footprints or scuff marks left by the attackers. They emptied the trash cans and wiped the handles of the back door. Every single surface that the perpetrators might have touched was systematically scrubbed clean before forensic investigators ever realized a violent crime had occurred. The immediate consequence of this catastrophic error sent shockwaves through the entire state of Indiana. When the bodies were discovered and the true nature of the crime was revealed, detectives returned to the restaurant only to find it spotless. The central hub of the abduction had been legally and thoroughly destroyed. The physical link between the perpetrators and the point of capture was permanently severed, leaving investigators staring at a sterile, useless environment. The lasting consequence of this botched response crippled the case for over 4 decades. Because the foundational physical evidence was washed away, the investigation was forced to rely entirely on circumstantial leads, jailhouse informants, and unreliable witness testimony. The destruction of the primary crime scene created an impenetrable wall between the tragedy and the truth. The failure to secure the building in those first crucial hours ensured that the families would be denied justice, trapped in a permanent state of unresolved grief. For the families of the 4 victims, the realization was utterly devastating. They learned that local authorities had allowed the primary crime scene to be meticulously washed away. This was not just a tragic loss of life, it was a profound betrayal by the very institutions sworn to protect them. The initial grief was immediately compounded by a deep, agonizing frustration. The entire state of Indiana watched in sheer disbelief as the investigation stumbled out of the gate. Parents across the region suddenly viewed their own communities with intense suspicion. Trust in local law enforcement fractured overnight. The sterile, empty restaurant stood as a monument to administrative failure. It left a permanent scar on the public consciousness that would never fully heal. Understanding this catastrophic failure requires looking closely at the era itself. In 1978, local police departments often operated with highly fragmented communication systems. Standardized crime scene protocols were not universally enforced across small, independent jurisdictions. The initial response to a missing persons report was frequently sluggish, burdened by outdated assumptions about teenage behavior. Authorities in 1978 initially assumed the 4 young workers had simply stolen the nightly deposit and run away. This flawed assumption dictated their entire early strategy. It blinded them to the grim reality unfolding just miles away. By the time investigators recognized the true nature of the event, the critical window for essential evidence collection had already slammed shut. The physical reality of the secondary crime scene stood in stark contrast to the sanitized restaurant. 2 days later, hikers stumbled upon a dense wooded area in Johnson County. The terrain was rugged, heavily overgrown, and exceptionally difficult to navigate. This isolated stretch of land was located nearly 20 miles away from the Speedway restaurant. Thick leaves and dense underbrush blanketed the uneven ground, obscuring crucial details. The autumn weather had already begun to degrade the exposed environment. Unlike the pristine tile of the commercial kitchen, this woodland scene was chaotic and heavily contaminated by nature. It was within this rugged landscape that the bodies of the 4 missing employees were finally discovered. Without the primary crime scene, the mechanics of the investigation fundamentally shifted. A criminal inquiry relies heavily on a documented chain of physical connections. Investigators need microscopic fibers, latent fingerprints, or blood drops to link a suspect to a specific location. When those physical anchors are entirely missing, the trajectory of a case almost inevitably turns cold. A cold case does not simply mean police stop looking. It means the investigative system has exhausted all verifiable physical leads. Detectives are forced to pivot away from concrete forensic science and rely entirely on human intelligence. They must depend on witness memories, anonymous tips, and circumstantial connections. These human elements degrade rapidly and unreliably over time. Investigators established a dedicated tip line to gather community intelligence. Detectives meticulously logged thousands of phone calls from local residents. They interviewed known offenders, cross-referenced vehicle license plates, and chased down rumors of suspicious vans seen near the restaurant. Each individual lead was documented, filed, and physically tracked on massive corkboards inside the precinct. Officers conducted extensive polygraph tests on dozens of potential suspects. They requested assistance from federal behavioral analysts to build a psychological profile of the attackers. Detectives even traveled across state lines to interview inmates who claimed to possess insider knowledge of the crime. Despite this massive procedural effort, the lack of foundational evidence rendered every confession fundamentally unprovable. The direct consequence of this evidentiary void was absolute investigative paralysis. The Speedway investigation fractured into dozens of competing contradictory theories. Some detectives suspected a botched robbery, while others firmly believed it was a targeted hit tied to local drug rings. Without hard forensic data to eliminate false leads, every wild theory carried equal weight. This severe lack of focus irreparably damaged the integrity of the official case file. Valuable resources were wasted chasing phantom suspects across the Midwest. The investigative team suffered from high turnover, meaning new detectives constantly had to relearn the convoluted details. The case essentially collapsed under the immense weight of its own unverified information. The emotional texture of the tragedy eventually shifted from active panic to a heavy, suffocating dread. Decades passed, and the silence from the authorities became a daily psychological torment for the victims' families. The empty chairs at holiday dinners served as constant, painful reminders of the justice they were denied. The wound remained open, refusing to heal. A dark cloud settled over the town, permanently poisoning the community's sense of safety. Residents whispered quietly about police cover-ups and protected identities. The unresolved trauma festered, transforming a vibrant suburban neighborhood into a place defined by its darkest secret. The failure to solve the case left a lingering toxic paranoia that successfully spanned multiple generations. To comprehend how such a brazen crime could happen, one must examine the environment where it began. The victims were part of a rapidly growing industry defined by late hours and minimal security. The fast expansion of franchise restaurants had created entirely new vulnerabilities. Young, inexperienced workers were frequently left alone to manage cash deposits late at night. These commercial spaces were specifically designed for rapid customer turnover during the day. They were not built to protect their occupants after the front doors were locked. The transition from a bustling diner to an isolated, empty building happened quickly. This sudden shift in atmosphere created an ideal, unprotected target for opportunistic predators waiting in the dark. The architecture of the typical fast food restaurant in that era emphasized extreme visibility from the street. Large plate glass windows surrounded the dining area, illuminating the interior like a brightly lit stage. However, the back exits and loading docks were starkly different. These rear areas were often poorly lit, shielded by dumpsters, and completely hidden from public view. The alleyway behind the Speedway location was heavily shadowed and unsettlingly quiet. A single dim bulb illuminated the heavy steel door used by employees taking out the nightly trash. The surrounding parking lot emptied entirely after midnight, leaving the rear of the building completely isolated. It was within this dark, unprotected perimeter that the attackers finally made their move. The fast food business model relied heavily on cash transactions in 1978. Credit cards were rarely used for small purchases. This meant that by the end of a Friday night shift, a substantial amount of paper currency sat inside the restaurant. The system required local managers to secure this cash before leaving. It was a standardized procedure designed for corporate efficiency, not physical security. Corporate protocols dictated that closing duties happened after the dining room was locked. The crew had to clean grills, mop floors, and count registers. This operational design effectively trapped a small team inside a highly visible glass box. They were isolated from the public while handling the day's profits. The system inherently prioritized preparing the restaurant for the next morning over immediate safety. On the night of the disappearance, the standard closing procedure was abruptly interrupted. The safe was found open, and approximately $580 was missing. However, the physical evidence of food preparation remained untouched. Half-eaten meals and partially cleaned equipment were left exactly as they were. The procedural timeline froze at approximately midnight, leaving a snapshot of an anomalous event. Investigators noted that the back door was left ajar. The padlock used to secure the exterior trash area was missing. Inside, the fry vats were turned off, but the final wipe down was incomplete. 2 empty coin rolls lay discarded near the open safe. These minute details established the exact moment the standard procedure was violently derailed. This sudden interruption had immediate and devastating consequences for the 4 young employees inside. Jane Freet, the 20-year-old assistant manager, was responsible for the crew and cash. Mark Fleeson, 16, and Ruth Shelton, 18, were finishing their cleaning tasks. Daniel Davis, also 16, was waiting for his shift to end. Their strict adherence to the closing routine placed them directly in the path of the intruders. The immediate result of the breach was the complete loss of control by the employees. They were forced out the back door and into the dark alleyway. Their personal belongings, including purses and jackets, were left behind. This indicated they did not leave voluntarily. The consequence of the robbery escalating into an abduction fundamentally changed the trajectory of the crime. The sudden vanishing of these 4 teenagers sent a profound shockwave through the local community. Parents who had trusted the safety of a neighborhood job were suddenly consumed by dread. The families faced an agonizing wait as the hours ticked by without a single phone call. Their children had simply gone to work and never came home. The silence amplified the growing terror. Friends and classmates gathered in small, anxious groups, unable to comprehend the void left by their peers. The realization that a part-time job could end in abduction shattered their sense of security. The employees were not high-risk targets. They were just local kids earning pocket money. This fundamental innocence forced everyone in Speedway, Indiana, to confront a sudden, inexplicable vulnerability. The initial response to this chilling mystery would ultimately dictate the fate of the entire case. When police first arrived on Saturday morning, they did not see a crime scene. They saw what they believed was a minor theft and a case of teenage truancy. This critical misjudgment initiated a botched investigation. The path to finding the truth was instantly compromised by a fundamentally flawed assumption. Because the police assumed the employees had stolen the money and gone joyriding, standard forensic protocols were ignored. The restaurant was not secured with police tape. The doors were not locked to preserve potential evidence. This decision shifted the investigation from a serious abduction case to a casual search for runaway teenagers. It was a transition that guaranteed the destruction of vital clues. By Saturday afternoon, the interior of the location was a contaminated environment. The franchise owner was allowed to bring in a new crew for the lunch rush. Unsuspecting customers walked through the dining room, ordering food and sitting at tables. The very floor where the abductors may have stood was aggressively mopped with industrial cleaners. The environment was systematically scrubbed of any trace of the midnight intrusion. The back alleyway, the likely exit route of the victims, was similarly compromised. Delivery trucks rolled over the asphalt, crushing any tire tracks left by the suspects. The trash dumpsters were emptied by municipal sanitation workers. The physical space of the crime scene was completely reclaimed by the daily operations of the town. Every passing minute erased another piece of the puzzle. The corporate burger franchise system demanded immediate reopening to minimize financial loss. Because local authorities had not declared the building a crime scene, the company followed standard operational directives. They replaced the missing cash, restocked inventory, and turned the brightly lit signs back on. The system functioned exactly as designed, prioritizing commerce over preservation. This ruthless efficiency inadvertently aided the perpetrators. The legal mechanism for securing a location requires a formal declaration by law enforcement. Without that declaration, private property owners retain full control over their facilities. The police department's failure to invoke this system meant they surrendered their authority over the physical evidence. The restaurant remained a functioning business rather than a protected forensic asset. This systemic failure created an insurmountable barrier for future investigators. It was not until Sunday, when the missing employees failed to return, that the procedural approach finally changed. The police officially upgraded the situation from a suspected embezzlement to a missing persons investigation. Detectives were finally dispatched to conduct formal interviews and photograph the location. However, they were documenting a pristine, freshly sanitized workspace. The procedural step of gathering fingerprints was now virtually impossible. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline using the few items that had been secured before the reopening. They examined the empty coin wrappers and the specific position of the open safe door. They reviewed the time cards punched by the missing crew members. Yet the chain of custody, meaning the documented timeline of evidence handling, was already irreversibly broken. The procedural foundation of the case was built on contaminated ground. The consequence of scrubbing the burger chef was the permanent loss of the attackers' identities. Any stray hair, muddy footprint, or microscopic fiber left behind by the intruders was gone forever. The physical link between the perpetrators and the point of abduction was severed. Investigators were left blind, forced to rely on rumors and circumstantial tips rather than hard science. This catastrophic loss of evidence severely limited the legal options for prosecutors down the line. Even if a suspect were identified, proving they were inside the restaurant that night would be incredibly difficult. The initial failure to protect the scene insulated the killers from future forensic advancements. The consequence was a permanent structural weakness in the case of these tragic murders that would eventually turn the investigation cold. The families of the 4 missing workers arrived at the Burger Chef restaurant expecting answers. Instead, they found a pristine dining room operating as if nothing had happened. The realization that the very ground where their children were last seen had been sanitized struck them with profound devastation. The corporate demand for normalcy had erased the final moments of their loved ones. Parents stood in the parking lot, staring at the brightly lit building, grappling with a deeply unsettling truth. The system designed to protect them had prioritized commerce over a meticulous search. This early betrayal created a lasting rift between the victims' families and the authorities. Trust evaporated before the full scope of the tragedy was even confirmed. While the restaurant resumed serving customers, the reality of the impending murders was unfolding miles away. The sanitized floors of the fast food joint could not stop the grim progression of events already set in motion. The focus of the desperate search had to shift outward into the dense, unforgiving terrain of the surrounding county. Investigators finally recognized that the missing teenagers were not returning to their homes or their workplaces. The initial assumption of a harmless joyride completely collapsed under the weight of passing time. Search grids expanded far beyond the city limits, moving into the isolated rural patches where darkness offered absolute concealment. 20 miles south of the Speedway restaurant lay a dense, heavily wooded area in Johnson County. This remote tract of land was defined by thick underbrush, uneven ravines, and towering oak trees that blocked out the moonlight. It was an isolated expanse entirely disconnected from the suburban glow of the city. The terrain was difficult to navigate even in broad daylight. A narrow, unpaved gravel road cut through the heart of this desolate woodland. Dead leaves and broken branches carpeted the forest floor, masking the subtle disturbances left by recent foot traffic. The air in the ravine was damp, heavy, and completely silent. It was here, in this secluded natural trap, that the tragic culmination of the abduction was finally uncovered. The discovery of the bodies fundamentally altered the jurisdictional boundaries of the Speedway police investigation. The case was no longer a localized disappearance confined to a small suburban department. It immediately transformed into a multi-agency homicide investigation spanning different counties. The logistical complexity of the case expanded significantly overnight. Different law enforcement agencies were now forced to share information, resources, and command structures. The Speedway authorities, who had initially mishandled the abduction site, had to coordinate with state police and county sheriffs. This sudden integration of distinct operational systems created immediate friction. Critical information was frequently delayed or mismanaged during the chaotic transfer of authority. Forensic pathologists were brought in to meticulously document the condition of the victims at the Johnson County site. They established a new chain of custody for the physical evidence recovered from the woods. Investigators recorded the precise position of each body, noting the specific mechanisms of trauma inflicted on the young employees. Every minute detail was photographed and cataloged for the official record. Technicians collected soil samples, clothing fibers, and ballistic evidence from the immediate vicinity of the ravine. They measured the distance between the victims and the nearest access road to reconstruct the killer's movements. The procedural rigor applied at this secondary location stood in stark contrast to the careless destruction of the primary abduction site. Yet the missing initial context severely hampered their analysis. The confirmation of the brutal killing sent an immediate shockwave across the entire state of Indiana. The illusion of safety in quiet suburban communities was permanently shattered by the sheer violence of the crime. Residents suddenly realized that systemic police failures could happen in their own backyards. Fast food restaurants across the state saw a dramatic drop in evening applications from high school students. Parents instituted strict curfews, refusing to let their teenagers work late shifts in isolated commercial strips. The economic and social routines of countless Indiana towns were fundamentally altered by the looming threat of the unidentified killers. A profound sense of collective grief settled heavily over the state capital and its surrounding neighborhoods. Memorial services drew thousands of mourners, many of whom had never even met the 4 young victims. The visual of 4 closed caskets placed side by side forced the public to confront the absolute finality of the violence. It was a heartbreaking manifestation of a community's worst fears. The families were left to navigate a terrifying new reality, haunted by the brutal details released in the press. Every unverified rumor and whispered theory only compounded their psychological torment. The emotional anchor of their lives had been violently torn away, replaced by an agonizing void of unanswered questions. The trauma experienced by these families became a shared generational scar for the region. As the initial shock began to subside, the reality of policing in 1978 became a glaring obstacle. The investigation was fundamentally constrained by the technological limitations of the era. The tools required to definitively connect the scattered pieces of evidence simply did not exist yet. Detectives were forced to rely on analog methods, sifting through thousands of paper tips and handwritten interview notes. The sheer volume of raw, unorganized data threatened to overwhelm the local task force. They needed a breakthrough, but the physical environment of the era offered very few shortcuts. The central command post for the investigation was a cramped, smoke-filled room cluttered with towering stacks of manila folders. Corkboards lined the walls, covered in black and white photographs connected by tangled webs of red string. Typewriters clattered constantly, generating endless pages of witness statements that were manually filed into heavy metal cabinets. The physical space reflected the overwhelming, chaotic nature of the massive manhunt. Evidence boxes were stacked precariously in unventilated basement storage rooms, vulnerable to degradation and misplacement. Blood samples and physical artifacts were stored without the strict climate controls required by modern forensic standards. The environmental reality of a 1978 police precinct was decidedly low-tech and inherently prone to human error. This fragile physical infrastructure held the only remaining keys to solving the quadruple homicide. The transition from an active manhunt to a cold case is rarely a sudden event. It happens gradually as the influx of viable leads slows to a trickle and the dedicated task force inevitably shrinks. The investigative machinery simply loses its initial momentum. Detectives find themselves waiting for the phone to ring rather than actively pursuing fresh avenues of inquiry. Investigators are eventually forced to triage their remaining resources. They must prioritize fresh murders over those with exhausted evidentiary trails. The organizational structure of a police department inherently favors active momentum. This institutional reality leaves stalled investigations vulnerable to administrative neglect. The system is designed to process new trauma, not to dwell indefinitely on unresolved mysteries. To combat this stagnation, investigators attempted to revitalize the inquiry by organizing the accumulated files into a standardized indexing system. Clerks manually transcribed thousands of handwritten interview cards. They created a rudimentary cross-referencing database using massive banks of index cards. This was a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaotic, disjointed collection of field notes and anonymous tips. They meticulously categorized suspects by physical descriptions, vehicle models, and known associates. The goal was to identify overlapping patterns that human memory alone could not detect. This manual data entry was painstakingly slow. It required hundreds of man-hours just to establish a reliable baseline of the existing evidence. Every piece of paper had to be evaluated and filed by hand. This administrative overhaul could not reverse the damage already inflicted on the case by the initial crime scene contamination. The newly organized files only highlighted the glaring gaps in the forensic record. Having perfectly indexed statements meant very little without physical proof. The meticulous paperwork simply illuminated exactly what the investigators were missing. Without uncompromised physical evidence to anchor the witness statements, the newly identified patterns remained purely circumstantial. The structural failure of the early botched investigation now acted as an impenetrable barrier. It actively prevented the local authorities from securing any future indictments. A solid legal foundation could not be built on a compromised crime scene, no matter how organized the files became. For the families of the victims, this bureaucratic stagnation functioned as a secondary, agonizing trauma. They attended monthly meetings with law enforcement, hoping for a breakthrough. Instead, they were consistently met with sympathetic but entirely empty updates. The lack of forward progress transformed their acute grief into a chronic, unending state of suspense. The realization that the investigation was effectively paralyzed bred a deep, corrosive distrust toward the local authorities in Speedway. Parents who had trusted the system to protect their children now felt entirely abandoned. They watched the institution sworn to seek justice quietly retreat from the fight. This failure severed the fundamental social contract between the community and its protectors. This localized failure occurred against the backdrop of a rapidly expanding fast food industry. The late 1970s saw these chain restaurants multiplying exponentially across suburban Indiana landscapes. They were fundamentally reshaping teenage employment and local social habits. These brightly lit outposts represented a shift in how middle-class America consumed meals and spent its leisure time. These illuminated establishments became ubiquitous symbols of modern convenience. They deliberately stayed open late to capture the growing nighttime economy. They offered a new kind of accessible public space for young people. This evolution fundamentally altered how communities interacted after dark, drawing teenagers out of their neighborhoods and into commercial zones during vulnerable hours. The architecture of a 1978 burger chef was designed strictly for daytime efficiency and high visibility. The buildings featured large plate glass windows and brightly lit dining rooms to attract passing motorists. However, the rear service areas and surrounding parking lots were often poorly illuminated. This architectural choice created stark, dangerous contrast zones between the interior light and exterior darkness. Back doors, used for taking out the trash at closing time, typically opened into dark, isolated alleys. These exits often faced unmonitored access roads bordered by dense woods or empty lots. These structural blind spots were an unintended consequence of the corporate design. The blueprints prioritized the customer-facing aesthetic over comprehensive perimeter security for the staff. The operational model of the fast food sector relied heavily on minimizing labor costs during these late-night closing shifts. This economic strategy dictated that only a skeleton crew remained on site. A small team was expected to handle the final cleanup, equipment maintenance, and cash deposits. Profit margins demanded absolute efficiency, leaving no room for superfluous security personnel. Corporate protocols mandated strict timelines for securing the building, counting the registers, and locking the safe. These rigid procedures heavily prioritized financial security and inventory control. However, they often left the young, inexperienced staff physically isolated. The system protected the day's profits, but ignored the physical vulnerability of the teenagers executing the closing duties.
The standard closing procedure required employees to execute a specific, highly choreographed sequence of tasks. This had to be completed before locking the exterior doors for the night. They had to scrub down the hot grills and carefully empty the boiling fryers. Simultaneously, others were tasked with carrying heavy refuse bags to the exterior dumpsters in the dark. The shift manager was simultaneously responsible for reconciling the nightly receipts in the back office. They had to secure the cash in a time-delayed drop safe while the crew worked elsewhere. This strict division of labor meant that employees were frequently separated across different zones of the restaurant. They were entirely unable to maintain visual contact with one another. This fragmented operational structure directly compromised the safety of the employees on duty that night. When the sequence of closing tasks was abruptly interrupted, the crew was already divided. The physical separation of the workers prevented any coordinated response to a sudden threat. They were isolated within their own workspace, cut off from their peers. The lack of a unified defense left the young workers highly susceptible to an organized intrusion. They could be targeted and subdued individually before anyone realized what was happening. The very procedures designed to ensure a smooth business operation had a fatal flaw. They inadvertently created the optimal, undefended conditions for a mass abduction. The immediate families of the 4 young workers woke up the next morning to an unbearable silence. Jane Freet, Mark Flemons, Ruth Ellen Shelton, and Daniel Davis were simply gone. Their parents expected them home by midnight. Instead, they were met with empty driveways and unanswered phone calls. The realization that their children had vanished without a trace from a brightly lit commercial space was deeply unsettling. This initial panic quickly transformed into a sustained, waking nightmare. The families gathered at the Speedway police station, seeking any fragment of hope or direction. They were entirely dependent on an investigative process that was already failing them. The sheer absence of information amplified their grief. They realized that the very system supposed to protect their children had left them completely exposed to an unknown danger. The botched response at the restaurant on that first morning set a disastrous tone for the days ahead. Evidence that could have pointed toward a specific suspect was already compromised or swept into the trash. The local authorities failed to secure the perimeter before the morning staff arrived. This early negligence forced the investigation to rely on rumors rather than hard forensic data. Investigators were left scrambling to reconstruct a timeline without physical anchors to guide them. They had to pivot from examining a preserved crime scene to interviewing unreliable witnesses. This shift in strategy fundamentally altered the trajectory of the entire case. The focus moved outward into the community, searching for whispers instead of processing concrete clues left by the perpetrators. The interior of the restaurant had been thoroughly scrubbed by the morning crew. Stainless steel countertops were wiped clean of any potential fingerprints or smudges. The floors were mopped with heavy industrial cleaner, erasing any muddy footprints or signs of a physical struggle. The back office, where the safe had been left open, was now contaminated by the presence of multiple unrecorded individuals moving through the space.
Outside, The parking lot offered no further clarity to the arriving detectives. The asphalt had been trampled by morning commuters and delivery trucks. Any tire tracks left by the perpetrators' vehicles were obliterated before noon. The physical environment, which should have been a pristine vault of information, was completely sterilized. It was a blank slate that offered absolutely no answers to the responding officers. The corporate structure of the Burger Chef franchise prioritized rapid reopening over investigative integrity. Management protocols dictated that a closed store was actively losing money, overriding any localized police requests to hold the scene. This rigid corporate system clashed directly with the immediate needs of law enforcement. Business continuity was placed above the preservation of a potential abduction site. This operational mandate created a massive blind spot for the detectives working the case. They were operating within a framework where commercial interests dictated the survival of crucial evidence. The chain of custody, meaning the documented timeline of evidence handling, was broken before it even began. Detectives found themselves fighting against corporate efficiency just to salvage any remaining data from the building. Officers attempted to retroactively catalog the missing items from the restaurant to understand the motive. They cross-referenced the nightly deposit slips with the contents of the empty time delay safe. They determined that approximately $500 was missing from the cash drawers. However, calculating the exact missing inventory was nearly impossible due to the disrupted paperwork and the chaotic morning shift. The investigative team then turned to the employee records to build a profile of the victims. They pulled the personnel files for Jane, Mark, Ruth, and Daniel to establish their exact roles that evening. Detectives interviewed the day shift workers to identify any anomalous customer behavior leading up to the closing hour. Every minute of the previous afternoon was scrutinized for potential red flags or suspicious interactions. The manager of the Burger Chef store ultimately had to answer for the decision to clean the restaurant so quickly. This premature authorization to sanitize the building severely limited the forensic pathologist's ability to understand the initial confrontation. The consequence was a permanent gap in the timeline of events. The critical window between closing time and the abduction was permanently erased from the record. Without physical evidence from the point of origin, the scope of the search expanded significantly. The police had to issue regional alerts across all of central Indiana. They alerted neighboring counties to be on the lookout for the victims' vehicles. The investigation ballooned from a localized property crime into a massive, uncoordinated statewide dragnet. For the community of Speedway, the expanding search brought a heavy, suffocating sense of dread. Residents who had frequented the restaurant began to view their own neighborhoods with deep suspicion. The realization that 4 teenagers could be taken from a familiar local business shattered their sense of security. Parents began enforcing strict curfews, terrified by the invisible threat lurking in their town. The families of the victims endured an agonizing limbo during this widespread search effort. Every phone call to the police station ended with the same hollow updates. They watched as the days dragged on, their initial panic hardening into a quiet, desperate resignation. The lack of tangible progress from the authorities only deepened their crushing isolation. The grim reality of the Speedway murders finally materialized 2 days later in a heavily wooded area. A hiker walking through a remote patch of Johnson County stumbled upon a scene that would permanently alter the investigation. The focus instantly shifted from a desperate missing persons case to a complex homicide inquiry. This shocking discovery forced the investigative teams to rapidly mobilize across county lines. Detectives from Speedway now had to coordinate directly with the state police and local sheriffs. The jurisdictional boundaries created immediate logistical hurdles. The transfer of vital information became sluggish just when rapid communication was most critical to securing the new site. The recovery site was located over 20 miles away from the restaurant. It was a dense, isolated tract of land surrounded by thick underbrush and uneven, treacherous terrain. The area was heavily shaded by a canopy of mature trees, plunging the ground into near-constant darkness even during the day. This remote location was practically invisible from the main county roads. The ground itself was covered in a thick layer of decaying autumn leaves. This natural debris absorbed footprints and made the search for minute physical clues incredibly difficult for the crime scene technicians. Weather conditions had further degraded the site, with recent moisture accelerating the loss of trace evidence. The environment actively worked against the investigators, hiding the final moments of the victims. The initial delay by Speedway police meant the timeline of the abduction was already fundamentally flawed before the bodies were even found. Understanding this timeline is critical to seeing why the subsequent forensic work failed. The investigators had to reconstruct a sequence of events across 2 counties without knowing precisely when the victims were taken. This gap in the timeline created a cascade of investigative errors. When multiple law enforcement agencies intersect, they rely on a strict chain of command to manage evidence. In this instance, that structure collapsed almost immediately. Information gathered at the restaurant did not seamlessly transfer to the recovery site. Different departments operated on conflicting assumptions about the motive. This lack of a unified command system meant crucial details were siloed within individual agencies. Detectives began logging the specific items found near the victims. They cataloged the victims' clothing and personal effects, noting that some items were missing entirely. The procedural manual dictates that every item within a 50-foot radius should be photographed in place before being touched. Instead, eager officers inadvertently stepped on crucial areas while approaching the bodies. They compromised the immediate perimeter before the state crime lab technicians even arrived. The technicians attempted to salvage the scene by establishing a grid search. They placed numbered markers next to a discarded watch, a set of keys, and scattered coins. Each marker was supposed to correspond to a specific entry in the master evidence log. However, the sheer number of personnel walking through the grid disrupted the exact placement of these items. The spatial relationship between the evidence and the victims was permanently altered. This contamination severely limited the Indiana State Police and their ability to build a reliable profile of the attackers. Without pristine spatial data, analysts could not determine the exact sequence of the murders. They could not tell who was struck first, or if the victims had attempted to flee. The ruined perimeter meant the physical narrative of the crime was lost forever. The failure to secure the woods led to immediate public backlash. Media outlets broadcasted the missteps, severely damaging the credibility of the task force. Citizens realized that the physical proof needed to catch the killers had been trampled by the very people sworn to protect them. This loss of trust forced investigators to rely heavily on unreliable witness testimony instead of hard forensic facts. For the families of the 4 victims, this realization was devastating. They had placed their absolute faith in the justice system to find answers. Learning that the evidence had been compromised felt like a second betrayal. It was no longer just about the loss of their children. It was about the agonizing knowledge that the truth had slipped through the fingers of the investigators. The community shared this heavy burden of doubt. Parents in nearby neighborhoods began implementing strict curfews, driven by a deep-seated fear that the perpetrators were still watching. The local restaurants, once vibrant gathering spots for teenagers, emptied out before sunset. A pervasive anxiety settled over the region. The botched response transformed a localized tragedy into a widespread, enduring trauma. The investigative methods of 1978 were already limited by the technology of the era. But the procedural failures magnified these limitations. The task force had to pivot their strategy away from the ruined physical evidence. They turned their attention to the broader network of criminal activity in the area. This shift in focus required them to interview hundreds of potential suspects, informants, and local residents. Moving from forensic analysis to widespread interrogations changed the entire tempo of the investigation. Detectives began chasing rumors and anonymous tips that flooded into the station. Each new lead promised a breakthrough, only to dissolve into another dead end. The search expanded outward, casting a massive net over the region in a desperate attempt to find a matching narrative. The incident room transformed into a chaotic hub of activity. Desks were buried under stacks of handwritten interview notes and typed witness statements. Wall-to-wall corkboards were covered with maps, connected by tangled webs of colored string tracing possible escape routes. The air in the room was thick with cigarette smoke and the constant ringing of rotary telephones. Outside the station, the suburban landscape felt increasingly hostile to the detectives. They drove down quiet residential streets, knocking on doors in uniform rows of identical houses. The autumn weather had turned bitter and gray, matching the grim mood of the search. Empty lots and abandoned barns on the outskirts of town were scoured, each location offering nothing but cold wind and rusted debris. As months turned into years, the reality of a cold case fundamentally altered the structure of the investigation. The massive task force was systematically dismantled due to budget constraints and shifting departmental priorities. Only a skeleton crew remained to manage the overflowing file boxes. The system for tracking leads transitioned from active pursuit to passive archiving. In this dormant phase, evidence management becomes a matter of preservation rather than analysis. The physical items recovered from the victims were sealed in brown paper bags and placed in long-term storage facilities. The chain of custody protocols required strict documentation for any future access. However, as personnel retired and departments reorganized, the institutional knowledge regarding these specific files began to fade. Decades later, a specialized unit requested the original evidence boxes from the state repository to apply modern forensic techniques. They meticulously logged each item out of storage, hoping to extract DNA profiles that were impossible to detect during the initial investigation. The technicians focused on the victim's clothing, using advanced swabbing methods to isolate foreign genetic material. They prioritized areas where an attacker might have grabbed the fabric. The laboratory protocols required the evidence to be processed in sterile, positive-pressure rooms to prevent modern contamination. Analysts placed the fabric samples under high-intensity alternate light sources to identify biological stains. They extracted microscopic fibers and subjected them to mass spectrometry. Every step was heavily documented in digital databases, a stark contrast to the handwritten ledgers of the past. Despite the advanced technology, the consequences of the original botched case proved insurmountable. The modern tests revealed multiple DNA profiles, but they belonged to the first responders who had trampled the site decades earlier. The genetic noise completely masked any trace of the actual perpetrators. The technological leap could not undo the foundational errors made in the woods. This scientific dead end finalized the devastating reality for the investigators. The physical evidence was officially deemed too compromised for prosecution. Any future breakthroughs would have to rely on a confession, an incredibly rare occurrence in decades-old investigations. The permanent loss of forensic integrity ensured that the legal system could never definitively answer who committed the murders. The realization that modern DNA testing had failed fell heavily on the surviving relatives. For 4 decades, these families had placed their final hopes on the Marion County Prosecutor's Office and the distant promise of advancing science. When the results only highlighted the contamination from 1978, that fragile hope finally collapsed. It forced a harsh, unavoidable reckoning upon the tight-knit community of Speedway. The families were not just grieving the violent loss of 4 young lives. They were mourning the permanent death of justice, effectively stolen by the very authorities sworn to protect them. The emotional burden of this institutional failure became a quiet, enduring trauma. The fast, chaotic police response on that initial Monday morning had essentially built an unbreakable wall around the truth. Investigators with the modern cold case unit now found themselves permanently trapped behind it. They had to pivot away from active forensic analysis and turn toward the grim task of historical preservation. This marked a fundamental shift in how the state handled the investigation moving forward. Detectives stopped looking for fresh biological markers or hidden fingerprints on the old evidence. Instead, they began treating the surviving files as fragile historical artifacts, preparing them for an indefinite stay in the municipal archives. This permanent lack of scientific resolution ultimately relegated the case to a sterile, climate-controlled storage facility on the outskirts of Indianapolis. The room is dominated by endless rows of heavy metal shelving, holding the remnants of a broken investigation. Fluorescent lights hum constantly overhead, illuminating the final resting place of the physical evidence. Standard cardboard banker boxes line the shelves, their printed labels fading slightly at the edges from years of storage. Inside these boxes sit thousands of pages of typed reports, grainy black and white photographs, and plastic evidence bags containing compromised fibers. Dust motes drift through the dry, filtered air, settling on the sealed containers. Beyond the police department, the tragedy forced a systemic overhaul within the fast food industry itself. Corporate risk managers realized that late-night closing shifts left teenage employees highly vulnerable to armed robbery. Chains across the Midwest began implementing rigid, mandatory security protocols to harden their restaurants against similar targeted attacks. These new systems required structural changes to daily store operations. Managers installed timed drop safes to minimize available cash after dark, removing the incentive for late-night theft. Companies mandated strict buddy systems for taking out the trash, and they began retrofitting buildings with rear door alarms and early closed-circuit surveillance cameras. Within Indiana law enforcement, the long-term consequence was a radical, permanent revision of crime scene management. Police academies introduced strict step-by-step procedures for securing an area before investigators could even approach the core site. The first responding officer was now required to establish a wide physical perimeter immediately upon arrival. Departments mandated the use of high-visibility barrier tape to lock down locations and keep unauthorized personnel out. They also instituted mandatory access logs for all active crime scenes. Any officer crossing the tape had to record their name, badge number, time of entry, and specific purpose, creating a verifiable chain of custody. These rigorous protocols fundamentally changed police culture across the state of Indiana. The careless, crowded crime scenes of the 1970s were entirely eliminated by the early 1990s. Officers learned to treat every unchecked environment as a fragile ecosystem of potential evidence, one that could be destroyed by a single misplaced footprint. The legal standard for successful prosecution rose alongside these new operational rules. Defense attorneys began aggressively challenging any gap in the access logs or evidence handling procedures. Consequently, forensic integrity became the absolute foundation of every major criminal case, ensuring the careless errors of the past could never be repeated. Yet these vital institutional improvements offered no comfort to the human beings left behind in the immediate aftermath. The siblings and parents of the 4 victims watched the world learn from their tragedy while their own nightmare remained frozen in time. Every anniversary brought a renewed wave of agonizing public attention. The families had to live with the agonizing knowledge that the killers were likely still walking free. They endured decades of empty chairs at holiday dinners and unanswered questions in the middle of the night. The botched investigation trapped them in a permanent state of unresolved grief, denying them any sense of closure. Over time, the narrative of the case shifted from a local horror story to a larger cautionary tale within the criminal justice system. At the Indiana State Police Academy, instructors began using the missteps of 1978 as a primary teaching tool. The tragedy became a textbook example of how quickly an investigation can disintegrate. This curriculum change bridged the gap between the historical failure and future prevention. Recruits studied the exact moments where the original detectives lost control of the restaurant and the wooded clearing. The Speedway disaster was transformed into a vital mechanism for training the next generation of law enforcement officers. Today, the physical landscape of the original crime scene offers no clues to the violence it witnessed. The dense woods where the bodies were found have been swallowed by suburban development and shifting vegetation. The earth itself has turned over, burying whatever microscopic traces might have survived the initial police trampling. The most haunting, unresolved question still lingers over the paved streets of the town, defying every attempt at resolution. The identities of the 2 unidentified men seen standing in the restaurant's alleyway that night remain a total mystery. Their composite sketches exist only as faded ghosts, staring out from the archival files, forever nameless. The catastrophic loss of evidence at the Speedway restaurant forced a permanent and sweeping restructuring of Indiana law enforcement protocols. Before the Burger Chef murders, securing a commercial crime scene was largely left to the casual discretion of the first responding patrolman on duty. Today, strict chain-of-command protocols mandate immediate physical barricades and specialized forensic oversight before any local manager or employee can cross the threshold. The botched handling of that single fast food location fundamentally rewrote the state's operational manual for violent crimes, ensuring a manager could never again sweep away vital clues. For the families of the 4 young employees, the absence of a trial meant navigating a cruel bureaucratic maze just to acquire basic death certificates. Because the investigation remained open but entirely stalled, releasing official documents became a prolonged legal battle that dragged on for years. Relatives had to petition local courts repeatedly to access the very records that confirmed their children were never coming home. The systemic failure to preserve evidence did not just let a killer escape into the night. It actively punished the surviving families with decades of painful administrative obstruction. This administrative blockade shattered the community's inherent trust in local authority and the criminal justice system. The citizens of Speedway had always assumed their police department operated with the flawless precision depicted in training manuals and reassuring public relations materials. When the reality of the unrecorded fingerprints and the scrubbed restaurant floors became public knowledge, that foundational assumption evaporated completely. The cold case proved that well-intentioned officers could completely dismantle a homicide investigation simply by trying to be helpful to a local business owner eager to reopen. Yet the most agonizing void in the public record is the exact sequence of events that forced 4 capable people into a single vehicle without raising an alarm. The physical evidence never explained how the assailants maintained total control over multiple victims without leaving a massive chaotic struggle behind in the restaurant. It remains deeply unsettling that a group of teenagers, working in a brightly lit commercial space on a busy road, could be quietly extracted into the night of 1978. The absolute silence of that departure is a permanent psychological weight on anyone who remembers the tragedy, leaving a lingering fear that safety is an illusion. Moving past the initial shock, the legal system eventually had to adapt to the grim reality of permanently stalled cold cases that offered no closure. Statutes regarding victim compensation and memorial funds were slowly adjusted to account for complex investigations that never reach a courtroom or a judge. This shift allowed communities to establish permanent memorials and distribute necessary financial support without waiting for a conviction that would clearly never materialize. The procedural deadlock inadvertently paved the way for new civil mechanisms to support victims of unsolved violence, changing how the state handles long-term grief. A quiet memorial now stands far from the original chaotic scene, offering a dedicated, peaceful space for reflection and remembrance. Etched into smooth stone, the names of the 4 victims provide a permanent anchor in a town that has otherwise drastically changed its physical landscape over the decades. Visitors leave small tokens, weathered by the changing Indiana seasons, at the base of this monument to honor the lives cut short. It is a stark physical reminder of the human cost, standing in sharp contrast to the vanished evidence and the empty files sitting dormant in police archives. The broader cultural impact of the tragedy altered how commercial franchises handled employee safety during late-night operations and closing shifts. The severe vulnerability exposed by the case forced corporate headquarters across the country to reevaluate the enormous risks placed on skeleton crews closing down empty restaurants. Security cameras, time-locked safes, and mandatory 2-person exit rules became standard operating procedures across the entire fast food industry. The structural weaknesses that allowed the abduction to happen seamlessly were systematically engineered out of modern restaurant designs to protect future workers from a similar fate. Despite these sweeping industry-wide changes, investigators still cannot verify the exact weapon used in the final, brutal moments in the distant woods. The varied nature of the injuries suggested multiple methods of attack, but the exact sequence of violence remains buried in contradictory forensic reports and lost physical samples. Detectives have spent decades cross-referencing similar crimes, searching desperately for a matching pattern in ballistics or blunt force trauma across different jurisdictions. Every comparison hits the same frustrating dead end, permanently blocked by the total lack of pristine baseline evidence from the original contaminated crime scene. Ultimately, the failure to secure the Burger Chef crime scene stands as one of the most consequential errors in modern American forensic history. It serves as the definitive textbook example of how initial assumptions and casual procedures can permanently destroy the path to a conviction before the investigation even begins. The legacy of the botched response is an entire generation of investigators trained specifically to avoid the tragic mistakes made on that autumn night. The permanent loss of justice for 4 young people became the harsh catalyst for demanding absolute forensic integrity in every major investigation that followed. Today, the building that once housed the Speedway Burger Chef remains an ordinary commercial space, stripped of its original signage and blending quietly into the Indiana landscape. But for those who remember the autumn of 1978, the structure stands as a quiet monument to a permanent absence. The most devastating detail of the entire tragedy is not what was left behind, but what was meticulously erased before the sun even rose on that Sunday morning. A late-night cleaning crew, following standard corporate protocol, wiped the stainless steel prep tables with industrial sanitizer, swept the tiled floors, and threw away the scattered trash. In their routine attempt to prepare the fast food restaurant for the morning shift, they unknowingly washed away the fingerprints, the footprints, and the very truth of what happened to 4 teenagers. That spotless, gleaming kitchen became a sterile void. It remains the defining image of a case that was scrubbed away before anyone even realized a crime had occurred, leaving 4 families to wait for answers that were already gone.